Hello, everyone. I'm Sister Vassa, and today I'd like to share with you a book that I just finished reading during my summer break. It's called Eastern Christianity in its Texts, and it's written by Father Cyril Hovorun. I think it's a very important book. That's why I'm sharing it with you. And I'm also talking about it in a YouTube video because I think a lot of people won't be able to or inclined to read it because it is almost 800 pages long. Nonetheless, I thought I could tell you sort of the cliff notes of it. And also, I invited the author, Father Cyril, who will be joining us in just a minute, to share with you about how in the world he managed to write such a long book and what he finds most important to pass on to the reader. But before we welcome Father Cyril, let me summarize for you the book's contents so that he doesn't have to do that, which I actually took a lot of notes on, as I can show you. I took 55 pages of notes. I needed a second notebook. This is the 55th page of my notes. The reason I took so many notes is because I do want to save the quotable quotes and also use some of these insights about church history and the history of theology in my future work. Here's a tip about reading this book. If you would like to just read the main parts of it, I would suggest that you read the first 26 pages, that is the introduction, in which the author, Father Cyril, really offers a very clear and concise summary of the book's main message and its purpose. But let me give you an idea of the book's contents so that he doesn't have to review the contents of the book for us. Basically, this book is a history of Eastern Christian theological thinking, beginning with the early church fathers and going through the following centuries through the Trinitarian and Christological discussions of the era of the Great Councils and of the first major schism of the Christian East, which delineated the separate non-Byzantine, non-Chalcedonian churches. And onwards goes the author through the histories of iconoclasm, and then of the great schism between East and West, then the demise and collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and of the post-Byzantine times under the Ottoman yoke in most of the Christian East, and also in Tsarist and Imperial Russia and in Ukraine. And he goes all the way up to the later 20th century with its many ecclesiological issues. That is, issues that focus on the nature of the church. But let me tell you a few things about the main part of this book and what the author has told me is the main reason that he wrote this book. It is the part of the book entitled Dialectical Taxonomies. Now, this fancy term, dialectical taxonomies, refers to not what the classical fathers and subsequent authors wrote about and talked about, but how they wrote and how they thought. You see, as Father Cyril takes the reader on this journey through the vicissitudes of Eastern Christian theological thinking, he explains how the fathers thought and wrote within the framework of logical categories, as they were educated to do, according to the logical disciplined thinking outlined by pagan Greek philosophy, which the fathers then Christianized and adapted to the theological questions facing the church of their day. The fathers did not just share their pious reflections or thoughts while shaving, so to say. They did not just use any terms that came to their minds, right? Any vague terms. Nor did the fathers shy away from introducing new terminology into Christian theology. I mean, terminology that was not biblical nor used by previous generations of Christians. They didn't have the kinds of categories we use today that are foreign to our tradition, the categories of being conservative or being liberal. Those who were introducing the new were actually the fathers, you will find if you follow church history and pay attention, right? They were introducing new things, which caused a lot of dissent amongst the conservatives of their time. But anyway, there was not a concern about being labeled liberal or conservative. They thought creatively and in new ways, but were firmly planted in the life of the church. So they also believed that the creativity within the church is what we're called to, right? To face ever new problems that come along within our historical context. And so they articulated their faith in a manner both creative and philosophically precise, so as not to allow for misinterpretations of the truth revealed to them in their church lives, in their experience of living tradition and thinking tradition. And throughout this survey of the history of Eastern Christian thinking, Father Cyril frequently has his eye on our church issues of today, so the reader can see how this or that theological question of old might relate and inform our theological discussions today. I want to note finally the many photographs that one finds almost on every page of this book, taken by the author himself. You see, Father Cyril travels a lot around the world, particularly throughout the Christian East, and here he has shared a lot of his personal photos taken with his iPhone. These are pictures of various archaeological sites and churches and monasteries and artifacts. And I think these many photos really lend a nice personal touch to this book. And it's something that makes the book both very modern and very orthodox. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it's very modern in our era of social media to share our photos along with our thoughts, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's very traditionally orthodox to accompany words with images. At least that's the way it is in our liturgical tradition. We don't only have the texts of liturgical services, we always have the icons in our liturgical spaces. And as one reads this book and goes on this journey with Father Cyril through the history of Eastern Christian theology, we also get a sense of him, the author, being an eyewitness to the physical setting of these historical events that he is taking us through. And in this very 21st century way, he is taking pictures along the way with his iPhone as one who is very much inhabiting our historical context in our social media age, in which we foster and build community online by sharing both our thoughts and our images with one another. So, this delightful combination in Father Cyril's book of sharing with us both the old and the new, that is, his encyclopedic knowledge of the old theological tradition, and his new way of sharing this through his own photos, and, as I've already mentioned, with frequent references to modern day issues, makes me think of Father Cyril Hovorun as the scribe in that parable in Matthew chapter 13, about whom our Lord says, "Therefore, every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old." Anyway, my friends, please find the book on Amazon and treat yourself to a copy of it. Read the first 26 pages if you're not going to read any other parts of it. I also highly recommend, I repeat, the chapter on dialectical taxonomies. It will be a bit of a workout for most people's brain, as it was for mine, but your brain will feel fitter afterwards, and you'll definitely discover some new things about the breadth and depth of Orthodox Christian theology. You might also be more careful, as I am learning to be, about your formulations and about the way we discuss theological and church related topics. I think that would be a valuable tool to overcome some of the polarizing effects of not really well thought out arguments that are quite confused and often illogical. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Father Cyril Hovorun. Hello, Father Cyril, and welcome back to Coffee with Sister Vassa.
Hello, I'm happy to be back indeed, and I greet all your viewers, all your zillions.
So, Father Cyril, we will get right to our first question. Please tell us when, where, and how in the world did you write this big book?
Well, I'll start with the second question, where it's the same room I'm sitting in and the same place. It happened during the pandemic. Actually, it was very helpful.
Where are you right now?
I'm at my home in Ukraine, near Kiev. That's my kind of working room. I work usually here, and I wrote my book here mostly. And it happened during the pandemic. It was really helpful, as I said. It kept me at home. I could not travel. Otherwise, travels are very destructive. They cannot. They don't allow you to do this kind of work. At least me. They don't allow me to do this work. Maybe you can do it better. And yeah, I was obliged. I was confined to this room, to this house, and I decided how I would use my time, and I decided to write a book.
So, did you do nothing else? Is that the way you did it?
Basically, yes, I did. I didn't do anything else but writing this book, and well, in the meantime, I also did a lot of research, a lot of reading, and it was really good, really great time. Almost like the time of my studies in in the university, in the seminary, when I read a lot and learned a lot, and I actually, by writing this book, I learned a lot.
Right. Well, anyway, thank you for writing it. It's just, I had to ask you that question because I just don't know how it's physically possible to write such a book, which is not just, it's not just a collection of texts as one might expect from the title, Eastern Christianity in its texts. It's really mostly your analysis of texts.
My own copy here.
You have your own copy. All right. So anyway, Father, could you also tell us what the main purpose of your book is, if you see it as having like a main purpose?
Well, it has several purposes. One of them is to produce something for my students. Usually when I teach, I provide my students with a lot of materials like articles, chapters, and so forth. I decided to have everything in one place, so to say, and to produce a book which would be teachable. And I know that there is a growing interest to the Eastern Christian studies in the Western academia, in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And people want to kind of have classes to learn in the universities on different levels, like on the undergraduate and on the graduate levels, about Eastern Christianity. And the purpose, I wrote this book with the purpose to be taught actually on both levels, so the undergrad and graduate levels. And the material is sorted out. I mean, the chapters, they fit approximately the length, the duration of a semester, so to say. So that's one of the practical purposes of the book. Another one is to contribute to the discussions, ongoing discussions about where to go theologically for Orthodox Christians. I believe that the kind of ideas of the past, of the 20th century, which were new when for example, I started learning theology, all those ideas about, the idea of persona, personhood, the idea of, Eucharistic ecclesiology, all those ideas were completely new, eye-opening, and really inspiring. And yet, I believe we need to go out kind of further. And the purpose of the book is to suggest some directions where we may go after this beautiful theology, which was written in the 20th century. So it's essentially a proposal for theology for the 21st century, which is also a proposal to come back to the roots. It has to do somehow with the idea of ressourcement, with coming back to the fathers, Father George Florovsky's idea of neo-patristic synthesis, but I wanted to make even a step even further than that. Another idea that I had in mind is to demonstrate, in the wake of the rising fundamentalism, rising growing culture wars in the Orthodox milieu, Eastern Christian milieu, when people fight each other on the basis whether who is liberal, who is conservative. Conservatism is being presented as a kind of new orthodoxy, and so forth. I wanted to demonstrate that it's a completely wrong direction for us to go, because our tradition transcends the culture wars. It transcends all those arguments, I think, shallow, really superficial arguments about conservatism and liberalism and so forth. Our theology, our tradition is much bigger than this sort of discussions. It's certainly much bigger than conservatism or fundamentalism. And I wanted to demonstrate that really the best that we had in our theology is very creative. It's very it's based on human creativity to a great extent, synergetic creativity between a human will and divine will, of course. And I wanted to demonstrate that the fathers of the church, they were not, conservative, stiff guys, but they were open-minded, eye-opening theologians that can inspire us to do theology in the same way, in a similar way, creative way, in our time and for the further generations.
Right. So if I understood you correctly, we could then overcome this polarizing polarized impasse, right, between conservatives and liberals, or traditionalists and progressives, through, I guess we would have to relearn what you call, or what are called, the logical taxonomies or dialectical taxonomies.
Well, yes, that's another thing that I wanted to do in my book, is to suggest a new kind of angle of looking at the fathers of the church and mothers of the church. I think we should be inclusive in this regard. We need to be what I wanted to do is, what I wanted to suggest is a kind of new framework of thinking, which is not really new. It's really old, but one can discover it only when one reads really the sources, the fathers and the mothers of the church, and then you discover really that Eastern Christian tradition is so rich, is so beautiful, is so well structured. Well, in contrast to the reality of the church life that we live through, as we know, our orthodoxy is now going through tests and turmoil, and we really experience all those inconsistencies, confusions, and so forth. Now the ongoing war in Ukraine is like an ultimate manifestation of this sort of confusion, and I think it's like an event of judgment for the entire tradition. But in the time of turmoil, in the time of crisis, we have our sources that really give us a very good anchor, give us a very good framework. And I believe our Eastern Christianity is really the best thing that we have. This tradition is really brilliant. It's really smart, is really inspiring, is really spiritual. I believe that after reading the sources, after writing this book, I just confirmed for myself that Orthodoxy is really great. It is really orthodoxy. It is really, the best thing that we can have in Christianity, and we just need to rediscover it. Rather, discover it not just by guessing what it is about, not just by assuming what it is about, but by studying it, by reading the sources. That's important. People who assume and do the guesswork in Orthodoxy, they become sort of fundamentalists. They become sort of kind of militant proponents of Orthodoxy that do harm, to Orthodoxy. They become sort of patristic fundamentalists, I would say. They become such just because, for the only reason for that is that they don't read the fathers of the church. They don't know them. So if you start reading the fathers in their context, in variety of venues and approaches that they demonstrate, you really understand the complexity, the multifacetedness of orthodoxy, the richness of orthodoxy.
Thank you, Father Cyril. That's very inspiring, I think, also for the prospects of more church unity and more productive discussions also between the churches. Now, I'll get to my next question. As you go through church history in this book and through the vicissitudes of theological thinking as it unfolded throughout the centuries, you write a lot about the church political context of each age, the church-state relations in various periods and regions of the Christian East, and how these church-state relations affected the church's own self-awareness. And we find that throughout most of their history, most of the Eastern Christian churches were established or part of the establishment. And in their more recent historical contexts, they became disestablished, as you point out. And what I'd like to ask you to share with our viewers is the positive aspects, the productive, positive aspects of being disestablished. In other words, not having state sponsorship or state promotion sort of as church. Say in the diaspora today, right? Under the Turkish yoke, obviously in earlier periods of most of the Eastern Christian churches. But anyway, the disenfranchised or disestablished status is what I'm
asking this. And well, it has to do with my personal trajectory somehow, theological trajectory. As most theologians in the Eastern Christian traditions, I started in patristics. Patristics is like our New Testament studies. Most like Protestant scholars would start with New Testament studies and then would move to other fields. Me the same in a sense that I started in the patristic studies in the patristic field, and then I moved to other fields to explore other fields, and this is a common trajectory for quite a few theologians in the East, I believe. So I started exploring the phenomenon of the church, the ecclesiology, and then the public or political theology, which also includes the church-state relations. And I try to kind of to look at those issues of the church-state relations, so the modern social issues, which are studied by public theology from the perspective of patristics. In a sense, I try to bridge, to marry those fields which seem to be unmarriable, but I tried, and I explored those bridges between different fields in this book exactly, and I continued somehow the work that I did before in my ecclesiological studies. Just before this book, I published a couple of other books on ecclesiology. I just want to show them. One is this Scaffolds of the Church. It's more about the church structures, how the evolution of the church structures, how they evolved in the history, and then meta-ecclesiology, which studies the evolution of this of the self-consciousness of the church, so to say, how the church discovered itself. And actually, to answer your question about what is the benefit of being disestablished, of disestablishmentness, I believe it's one of the longest English words that I've come across, disestablishmentness. So what is the benefit of it? I believe is that the church then, as a result of being separated from the state, discovered itself. I observed this very strange phenomenon when, in the period of the golden era of the Orthodox theology, starting in the 4th century onwards, we have this beautiful theology of the Trinity, of the Incarnation, and so forth. But we have a kind of diminishing theology of the church as the centuries passed. And it was really an enigma for me. Why? The more the theologians discussed, God, incarnation, and so forth, human beings, the less they discussed the phenomenon of the church. And my kind of answer to this enigma, my solution to it, was that it's because of this merge between the church and the state and the empire, to the extent that discussing the church meant a political discussion, which was not always safe, at the time. And only after, in modernity, in the modern time, and the modern period is characterized by the separation between the church and the state, and by secularization, by the way. Only in the modern time we see ecclesiology re-emerging, at least in the Christian East. It had re-emerged a bit earlier in the West as a result of the Reformation, but because we didn't have our own Reformation, we had this separation between the church and the state that triggered, the reflections upon the church more intensively. And that's why in the 19th century, the Orthodox theology properly emerged as a result of the theological and philosophical reflections in the Russian Empire, for example. Alexei Khomyakov is believed to be the father of the Orthodox ecclesiology, and he was exactly thinking in the new modern framework when he wanted the state to keep distance from the church, or rather the other way around, the church to keep distance from the state. He also was familiar with the secular philosophy of his time, especially with the Hegelian philosophy. And this combination of secularization and separation between the church and the state created a kind of mirror, in which the church, the Christians, could see what they are as a church. And that is the kind of the good thing about the modern developments, that they created a possibility, a chance, an opportunity for the church to reflect upon itself properly, to see itself as distinct from the state. And that's how ecclesiology was born. So that's the kind of the fact that we have ecclesiology, that we can discuss the church, properly, without having any political discussion necessarily. It's the main benefit of our times.
Oh, right. So you would say that, well, you're mentioning one productive and positive thing of being disestablished as sort of church identity becoming
re-emerged. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's very useful that you have chosen to devote yourself to ecclesiology. I did read both of those other books, and any viewers out there that are inclined to do so or to learn something about ecclesiology, if you read nothing else, do read those two books that Father Cyril has showed us today. Yes, they are. One good thing about those books is that they're a lot shorter than the one that I showed you before.
But there is a secret about those two books. Just sorry for interrupting you. They were intended to be one book. So in this case, they would have been like as thick as this one. But then the publisher insisted that I should divide them, so I published them separately as two books. Otherwise, they would have been, unreadable
like
as this one.
Yeah. Well, I really love this book. It was just not something that was very easy, say, to take with me to the river when I went swimming. I'm on my summer break, so it's the downside of this book is only that it's hard to take it with you. But here's what I wanted to say, Father Cyril. I should be saying sorry for interrupting you, since I did invite you so that we hear from you. But I can't resist to say the following, that I think that in addition to this cataclysm of the church, a lot of the Eastern Christian churches losing their established status, now we have what is a more gradual cataclysm of building online communities, of having church sort of happen in a way online, right? And having, yes, this sort of communion, and I would say challenge of so much exposure to diversity and to outsiders, that we're much more up close and personal with those who are, number one, perhaps very similar to us in views. So I would say dangerously similar, that we recognize perhaps similarities that might suggest to us that this is also church or part of us. And on the other hand, we have those who are indeed very different, and we know more. We know more about them. We know more about one another, to the point where, a lot of this information might be really pulling at the seams that used to automatically hold us together. So I think that you're bringing out for people, you collect various metaphors, about the church, because you show us that it was metaphors about the church that were more descriptive than any official definitions, but that there were different models of envisioning what the church is. Anyway, I think that it's so vital now to have, these examples and the few helpful tools that we do have to envision and understand and strive for that which is assigned to us as really a constant, there's a constant challenge to keep becoming church, I think, that you help us to see. Anyway, I wanted to hear from you as to what do you think in the social media age would be helpful for people to sort of keep it together, to keep their church affiliation sound. I guess you might have already given us an answer, but if you could reflect further on these aspects of internet like church being, how would this affect the further refining of our church identity?
Well, yes. Well, the internet certainly cannot substitute the church, and I don't believe in an online church, but certainly online activities and social media can help us to feel better this togetherness, which is the basic feature of the church. One of the kind of natural, in my own language, characteristics of the church, properties of the church is the togetherness of its members, and the togetherness we experience online. And actually, with you, we did it while I was sitting in this room and writing this book. We did some online activities with you during the pandemic when we celebrated Agape, for example. You were in Vienna, I was here. There were some other people on different continents, and they joined us. And in the kind of during the breaks of writing the book, I participated in this Agape, which was a great experience. It was not liturgy per se; it was a kind of quasi-liturgical experience, nevertheless. And I think it was a great experience, very helpful, especially during the pandemic, which can be continued even after the pandemic. Speaking about the social media, well, in our days, people read mostly social media, including myself. I would not, if someone else would have written this book properly, I would not read it. I would prefer to scroll through the social media. But knowing this, I published, before I wrote this book, some pieces, some excerpts from the book on my Facebook, Telegram, and other social platforms, exactly to entice people somehow to for further explorations, if they want to. Well, I understand that this book is not to be read by many, certainly, but some excerpts can be accessible through the social media from the book. And my main target are actually the students. They have to read the books, right? They have their assignments, and they can't escape it. But social media would help those who are not students, who don't have assignments, to be enticed, maybe to browse through, skim through the pages, of the book. That's why they are they are supplementary to each other, the social media and the books. I don't belong to this group of people who are very skeptical about social media. They say, well, if you are on the social media, you're stupid. You can be smart only if you read books. I think it's a wrong dichotomization, so to say. They just help each other, the two things.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your contribution to helping us, even as we do discuss things. As you have pointed out just now, it's inevitable, to have this type of communication. And also tradition, which is a moving target, right? It's being passed on and received now in the new ways of communication, right? So for you to remind us of certain rules of the game of church discussion, of theological discussions, because people are learning and living tradition, receiving and passing on through these new means, right? So we still need some discipline, and we are rooted in a patristic tradition. I would argue that it's not a matristic tradition, even though you have mentioned mothers, but there is no page on your book until the last few pages that female voices are heard, except for
Not
Macrina.
very true, because I try to include also some voices from apophthegmata from Egypt, some female
There's
voices.
like one, I'm sorry, there's like one. And then Macrina, whose words are passed on through her brother, Gregory of Nyssa. And then because you remember that it's not your fault. The fact is that there are very few voices. And
Yeah.
I don't think we should pretend that the fathers, it's called patristics for a reason and not matristics.
Well, still, I think
No.
what I try to demonstrate in the book exactly is that, yes, the female voices were marginalized in the past, but they were voices. And what I try to do, I try to include all of them. I mean, all those available, more or less.
That's why there are so few. Yes,
Yeah.
all of them is very few. I can't even remember the name of those. But anyway, you did remember them on like page 769 and 70. So you ended with a quote. You ended with a quote. No, thank you for the effort. E for effort. E for effort, my friend. But I don't think it's.
And I made the point
Yeah.
to finish the book with the voice of Mother Maria Skoptsova. I think it was important to kind of to put the final full stop in the book by quoting her.
Yes, so thank you for that. But I don't think it's helpful when we add mothers to fathers as if there is an equal balance there of voices. It's just not true. And it's interesting to learn the reasons for this, right? Like, did they really have a lot to say? Perhaps we might learn more about the fact that women really were not educated in most of the Christian East for most of the time. So I'm getting to my next question actually about issues like, well, not only gender equality, right, but issues of human rights, of slavery, of issues that really in the modern day became a thing and something that's discussed and cared about. Various freedoms. You talk about this very helpfully in the book. What the issue is. You don't pretend in the book that the Eastern Christian churches were always all about this, human rights and freedom. You say that there was an esoterization of human rights and also of gender equality to a certain degree, and that this still goes on today. I'm not going to explain this further. I would ask you, Father Cyril, to explain to us what do you identify as the esoterization of human rights, freedoms, and also gender equality, and how has this or not changed in our church approach today to these phenomena?
Yes, thank you for this question, and it was indeed important for me to reflect upon. In the book, well, esoterization of all those things like freedom and equality and everything else is the way to avoid dealing with the issues. Is the way to preserve the status quo, however unhelpful it is, by saying, well, if you are not free, if you are a slave, the reality of slavery was very much pertinent to Eastern Christianity until the 19th century, essentially, when, like in 1861, slavery was abolished in Russia quite late. And it was an Orthodox kind of a Christian empire, super Christian Empire, and still they had slavery. They had slavery in Byzantium. They had slavery in the time of the great fathers of the church, and the fathers had slaves, including, for example, Gregory the theologian, who was so much against slavery in principle. And
Yes, these were wealthy men. These were wealthy, well-educated men.
and they just inherited all those slaves, but they didn't do actually much to change their life. I mean, and what was brought up as an excuse is that it's enough, it's sufficient to have like internal freedom for a human being, not to be really free in the classical Greek sense, because free in Greek, eleftheros, literally, etymologically means someone who can go wherever he or she wants. Elefsome, I will come wherever I go, wherever I want, which was actually a feature of the free people, not slaves. If I am a free person, which was a minority in the classical antiquity among the people, I can go wherever I want. If I am a slave, I can't. I have to ask a permission of my master to go wherever I go. Therefore, I mean, for the ancient Greeks, to be free meant primarily one thing: to be able to go wherever I want, meaning to be free physically, politically, socially, And in Christianity, this concept of freedom became esotericized, so to say. It became esoterical in the sense that, well, it's enough for you to be free, within yourself, and then I will be your master still.
So this is what is esoterization, just so the viewers understand. So
Exactly.
esoterization of, human rights and of these things that we talked about, it's to say esoterization means to indicate that this is internal, yes, internal, some kind of spiritual freedom, but not external.
And this actually translates into the modern situation, into the modern circumstances that we are living through. That if you, for example, allow a person to be a slave, if you are okay with a person to be a slave just by saying to him or her, well, enjoy your internal freedom and do what I dictate you to do, then it can actually translate to the social realities, to the political realities, that a nation, a people, can be enslaved, can be under the circumstances of dictatorship, as long as that people, that nation, enjoy some kind of, practices, some kind of Christianity. For example, we observe it like in Belarus, where there is a dictatorship and there is a strong church, and the leadership of the church is very much like hesychastic and, encouraging people to cherish, to cultivate internal freedom without urging, without mentioning the necessity of having political freedom. The same is in Russia, for example. Well, the model situation was in Greece. In Greece, when the Greek Revolution happened in the beginning of the 19th century, 1921, there were discussions in the Greek church. What does freedom mean? Some kind of influential leaders, even the patriarchs, would argue that, well, it's enough for you, for the Greeks, to have this kind of internal freedom, which comes with Christianity, but remain under the Turkish yoke, remain the subjects of the Ottoman Empire. It's all right, And then in Greece emerged this idea that the internal freedom is not enough. It should be also an external freedom. It also comes from God, from Christianity. It's one of the basic messages of Christianity as well. And now it's like a common belief among the Greek Orthodox, including saints, who argued, recent saints, who argued that it's important to have, also external freedom. Internal freedom is not enough. It's something that people in Russia or in Belarus and other countries, some other countries, need to learn still, that internal freedom is not enough. The complete freedom is needed when it comes with internal freedom from sin, freedom for Christ, and external freedom from dictatorship. Both things are important, and it's like a whole thing. Freedom in completeness would include both internal and external freedoms.
Thank you, Father Cyril. And about, say, gender equality, was there also an esoterization of
Indeed so.
this
Indeed so. It
idea?
applies to the entire variety of the rights, of the freedoms. Well, gender equality is a part of freedoms. Well, it's a freedom for a woman to be to do what she considers important to do. And again, to women, quite often, well, the Christians, even the Christians, apply this principle that it's enough for you to be, internally equal with man, and then you will have to be subjugated. You have to be kind of under the authority of man, as long as you preserve your internal freedom. But again, in this case, it's not enough to have just internal freedom, to have just internal equality. And it's quite interesting that in the Eastern Christianity, the equality between men and women could be observed in the past, mostly in the monastic communities, when like someone who was a nun was allowed to write theological treatises and they were accepted, was allowed to teach, was allowed to instruct, including spiritually, that which was considered to be like a man's prerogative, and women were allowed to do this only from monastic perspective, from the monastic context. I think it's really a reduction of the equality which Apostle Paul spoke about, which Christ spoke about himself. Yeah, so you asked about categories, and I try to apply thoroughly across the book, throughout the book, the categories that come from the classical Greek philosophy, from Aristotle, and before him, and after him from his commentators. And I think if we apply categories to the issue of freedom, the issue of equality, it may work very, very well. That's where the power of tradition can be applied. Let me explain you a bit in more detail. So the paradox of Aristotle is that Aristotle was a proponent, advocated for the segregations, for the separation between the classes, between the genders. He believed that like slaves, children, women are inferior groups of people. They have inferior natures, and well, the most superior kind of nature that Aristotle advocated for was a nature of free males, white males. Well, almost like in the perception of the United States, like wasps, so to say, right? So essentially, what Aristotle argued for is very similar to the concept of WASP, WASP, which means white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's like the cream of the cream of the society from the perspective of like supremacists and racists in the United States. So Aristotle believed that because like women, children, slaves, they have very different functions in the society. They have a very different nature, human nature, which is different from the male, like the nature of the free males, which was, of course, a wrong idea, completely wrong idea. And Christianity substituted this idea with a very different approach. But that approach was based on Aristotle. And Christians, that's where the Christians were very creative, really creative, in developing the Aristotelian categories into something which was different, even opposite to Aristotle, but which reflected much better the Christian message about the human nature. So what the Christian theologians did, they argued that because Christ embraced the entire human nature, because God became incarnated and assumed the entire humankind, all the differences, ontological differentiations within the human society were eliminated, were just equated, completely equated, that everyone, a woman, a man, a slave, a Greek, a Slav, a Scyth, and so forth in Paul, they are all the same in Christ, which means that the human nature is the same for everyone, which was a very kind of radical statement for the world of antiquity. The world of antiquity was based on the ontological differentiation between different classes, genders, social functions. Well, people believe that a slave, for example, or a woman is somewhere in between a human and an animal. They were inferior beings by being like that, by being a woman, by being a slave, and so forth. It was believed that it's in their nature, and exactly this Aristotle reflected upon in his treatises. What Christianity did, the Christian theologians, they argued that all human beings after Christ are all the same, because the entire human nature has been assumed by God. And they applied the Aristotelian category of commonality. They said, because all human beings, they feature the same properties, they have the same nature, they are absolutely equal with one another. Therefore, there are no difference between like males and females, between slaves and free. And well, hence is the idea that all people have to be free. All people have to be non-slaves, as we would interpret, the Christian message based on the Aristotelian categories nowadays. So here we have, and that's my argument. That's kind of the argument that I do in my book, that if we apply creatively the Aristotelian categories to the modern, elaborated upon by Christian theologians, by Christian logicians, dialecticians, in a creative way to modern issues, we can come up with the idea, we could endorse the idea of human rights. We could support the idea of, equality, radical equality between male and female genders, between all different social classes, between races. This is probably would be one of the most convincing arguments against racism, against nationalism. Well, racism is very much a problem in the American society. Nationalism is very much a problem in the Orthodox milieu. So we can tackle those issues by applying those categories, which had been elaborated upon by the Christian theologians that had applied them to God, to Christ, to the church, and so forth. We apply them to the human rights, and we come up with a very good results, theological results, as a result of this creative theological work.
Yes, indeed, Father Cyril. I was thinking also that I don't remember at any point in the development of our theology that the maleness of Christ's priesthood, right? The priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek was discussed. So Christ's maleness, and that which keeps coming up in the discussion of any female, priesthood, or say the ranks below the priesthood, like the diaconate, it's an important topic that really is not even really contemplated on such a feast as the circumcision. Christ's maleness is not a topic of this feast in any of the hymnography or in any of the writings on this topic. It's all about his obedience to the law. And it's about the name giving, it's about the eighth day symbolism, but maleness.
And the fulfillment of the law, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly, fulfillment of the law, obedience. But we pass by the whole topic of if we return now to this topic of the Aristotelian or Porphyrian and, the sort of adaptation to Christian theology of this dialectical taxonomy, if we take something like priesthood in the era of the church, if we apply to the discipline of this taxonomy, right, the priesthood in the era of the church, and then we ask ourselves the question, is the priesthood of Christ, right, that we presume must be extended to every member of the church, right? Is the maleness part, because he's male, there's no doubt about it, is it a property without which the thing wouldn't be the thing, right? Or is it an accident? One of the simvevikota. So it would be, I think this question, even though I once raised it on one of my videos, and then, I got a lot of slack for it, but what do you think of this question? I mean, is it without the maleness, would there still be his priesthood? Or is priesthood part of the package of our salvation, of our being empowered? Everyone who has put on Christ, has everyone who put on Christ also fully put on priesthood? Or do we have this? I understand we are all educated in the fact that there is a sacramental priesthood and then there is this royal priesthood. But is that distinction really in there, in the thing itself, in the priesthood as you see it, Father Cyril?
Oh, it's an excellent point, an excellent question, and you have answered it already. And I think
I don't have the answer, though. I don't know how I answered it. I really am asking a question, not a rhetorical one.
Yeah, I understand that. But I mean, you already kind of. I see that you read the book and you started thinking along the lines in the framework.
I did read the book.
And yes, I see the result. The result is kind of a new framework of thinking, a matrix of thinking, as it were, that helps you, I believe, to look at many things in the church from a very different perspective, and maybe to find a better solution than what we have. From this perspective, from this matrix of thinking, I differentiate between the nature, the properties, natural properties, and the, as you said, simibikota, or accidents, fluctuating qualities of the nature. So to say, those are Aristotelian categories, which were elaborated upon, as we said, creatively by the fathers, especially by fathers like Maximus the Confessor, in the framework of the Christological controversies. And I should say, also mention that it was not coincidentally, not accidentally, that the malehood of Christ was not really affected upon theologically in the patristic texts, for a very simple reason, because it would be very unchristian, unchristological, untheological. It would be very much against the incarnation, because the incarnation happened for everyone, for males and females.
Exactly. But see, my friend, in this specific topic, maleness comes up, right? Because every time you point out, but because you're a woman, you can't do this in the church, then you are implying that you're also talking about maleness. And you can't do one without the other. When you focus in on the femaleness,
exactly. Well, that's why it is important to understand, this difference between the natural properties, which reflect, which exactly demonstrate, reveal the nature of anything, of Christ, because Christ had properties, two natural properties, the divine ones and the human ones, through the incarnation. And that's where the discussion started, actually. All those categories were employed as a result of those Christological discussions primarily. And then we could apply those discussions, those distinctions, to other fields, to other aspects of the church, including priesthood. So from this perspective of the categories, we can see that, for example, the royal priesthood of everyone is an intrinsic feature of the nature of the church. By the fact of us being members of the church, of our belonging to the church, we adopt this natural feature of priesthood as royal priests. All of us, I mean, females, males, and everyone else who is a member of the church. Then we can be ordained. Well, not everyone, as of now at least, only males. And again, not every male can be ordained, as we know. And that is very accidental thing in the terms of the Aristotelian Porphyrian categories. The accident of simibikos is something that happens to a nature as a result of the development, and it can be done, can be undone to the nature. It's not pertinent to the nature, in other words. It's more superficial. And I believe that from this perspective, the priesthood, I mean, the sacramental priesthood, it's like a symbibikos of the nature of the church. It's different from the pieties or the quality, the natural property of the church, which belongs to every single member of the church. So we should not confuse
because
those.
there is this question that the author of Hebrews is at pains to explain. And his question in that time of the author of Hebrews is a similar one, because it's not easy for him to explain to his crowd, right, why the Levitical priesthood now is being extended to some kind of what nobody understood before, this mysterious priesthood of Melchizedek that disappears, right? We see him once, but he's clearly some kind of a priest in the Old Testament. So he is at pains to say why there is this radical change that now people who, according to their physical difference, that they're not Jews, that they're not belonging to the same tribe, specifically within Judaism, that the Levites and the descendants of Aaron, that others outside of that very narrow bloodline, right, are going to be allowed to be priests. So it's interesting to me what work is done by the author of Hebrews to have this very strict little closed circle, of according to physical bloodline, right, to be broken out of to others. I think that juncture, when that happens, that break with the Old Testament priesthood, well, I think that the work is already done there to break out of physical, accidents of the priesthood to establish, okay, no longer is any physical attribute necessary for the priesthood. Perhaps I'm putting it in a very provocative way, but further, okay, one can say yes, but even Melchizedek is male. Anyway, I think that we have a foundation there to look at these things in a stricter way, and not in this way that's very vague. That's like, well, all of the apostles seem to have been, male. But is that true? Why were previous generations willing to use titles that never would somebody attach to a woman today? Equal, not to the bishops, but even to the apostles, equal to the apostles. Nobody would ever dream of calling a woman equal to the apostles today amongst new saints. So anyway, these are things that you open up for us, Father Cyril, the possibility to take to a disciplined, serious level, a discussion that really is difficult because, like you said, we never had a discussion of Christ's maleness in all of the development of Eastern Christian theology. And implicitly,
that would have been heretical in the sense of reductive of Christ's incarnation. Every heresy, by definition, I mean, the classical heresy is always a reduction of the incarnation. So speaking about the exclusiveness of Christ's maleness would be heretical because it would be reductive.
Right. And here's a question. How reductive is it of the new priesthood to limit it to males? I mean, isn't that mitigating the consequences of the incarnation? Mitigating also things that he explicitly went out of his way to show us when he talks to the Samaritan woman, and he clearly, has her off on her apostolic mission to, bring to the light her entire village. When he goes out of his way to honor, even he makes up stories, parables, like about the Good Samaritan. He goes out of his way to make the heretic the good guy. Our Lord seems to be crossing certain boundaries that we don't seem to really, throughout the generations, really take that seriously. But Father Cyril, you know what? There's another thing that I want to ask you before we finish this delightful conversation with you. This will seem like it's off of our topic, but I think it has everything to do with freedom, the freedom both of men and women, and human will and free will vis-a-vis certain mechanisms in our church, like the concept of obedience, that might seem to threaten a person's freedom and also dignity. So I want to ask you this. In the discussion that happened in the 7th century, mainly about human will and free will and its movement, I noticed in your book that you don't discuss certain things in connection with the movement of the human will in the work of Maximus Confessor, how he redeemed the goodness of the human will with regard to earlier opinions. For example, we see that Origen, he thought that it was the initial state of in the way that he conceived human souls. It's contested whether he really thought they pre-existed or within God's mind. But anyway, that there was stasis or stillness, not a lack of, there was no movement. And then it was actually part of the fall that human souls began to move, and all of this led to Genesis, or coming into being created as a result of already a pre-physical sort of fall. And Maximus, okay, I am finishing the question. Maximus did something to redeem this notion that movement initially is a bad thing. That's it. Could you reflect on this and explain it more coherently?
With a pleasure. First of all, well, I tried to encapsulate some of those discussions to the book, but I couldn't do it as extensively as I did in my first book, actually, which I published. This one, it's about the controversies in the 7th century about the will, action, and.
I haven't read that book. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, it's the thinnest one actually that I've had, and it's based on my dissertation in the UK. In Durham. So essentially, I explored in much more detail what you're asking about, and the brief, as much as possible, brief answer to the question is the following: that Origen thought and worked in the church, which was not yet affected very much by Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism was emerging in the time of Origen. Origen was much more under the spell of Stoicism, actually, which also inspired Paul and the Pauline epistles, writings. And stillness is much more important, I believe, in Plato himself and in Stoicism than in Aristotle, that influenced Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is a kind of merge, is a synthesis of Aristotle and Plato. And Maximus was much more Aristotelian than Origen. Also by the fact that Aristotle was not very much known in the time of Origen. He was discovered approximately the same time and was not yet spread widely. So for Aristotle, movement is important. Aristotle is speaking about the first mover, that God. Well, implying one God, even in the time when Aristotle lived. That was the way how Aristotle, reflected upon the singularity of the divinity of God through the movement. That movement is something which is pertinent to God, to the supreme God. And this is something that Maximus somehow takes from Aristotle, from this Neoplatonic tradition, and redeems kinesis, movement. It was also important, not just because Aristotle said so, but because of the incarnation primarily. And the incarnation was the movement of God towards humankind, right? It was salvific. It is the reason, the root of the salvation, the movement, kinesis of God towards human beings. Also, the creation is the kinesis of God towards outside, the divine sphere. And Maximus reflected upon this extensively. And what is even more important, that for the opponents of Maximus, the monothelites, those people who argued that Christ did not have a human will, but had only the divine will, they argued that the human will, human freedom per se, existentially, ontologically, is destined to be bad, to be damaged. That's why they rejected the very idea that Christ would have, human will or human movement. The monoenergies, the who preceded the monothelites, they argued that Christ had only the divine movement, only the divine energy, activity. They deprived Christ of the human activity and human will. Maximus, in contrast to them, argued that everything that we have in our nature, including movement, will, is good per se, ontological. They can be bad only when we abuse it as a result of our free choices, wrong choices. So that was a redemption of the idea of will, of human will, and of human freedom, which is very important for us because, yes, we have this idea of obedience, of being cautious, of not abuse, of being cautious to avoid abusing, our freedom. But sometimes by being cautious of abusing of our freedom, we reject freedom altogether. We get rid of it. And this is wrong. This is monoenergistic and monothelitic. It's heretical. Freedom is important. Human freedom is important. Human freedom is redeemed in Christ. Human freedom is clean per se, ontologically. And by rejecting human freedom, you just cancel everything. You cancel the church, you cancel the incarnation, you cancel everything. You cancel the creation of human beings by God. So it's essential. It's fundamental. It's something that upon which our theology stands, on which the church stands. That's why I argue in another ecclesiological books of mine. I argue that a basic feature, natural feature of the church is freedom. If you exclude freedom from the church, you get a sect. Then the church turns into a sect. Only freedom, the affirmation of our belonging to the church, which is happening every day, not just during our baptismal vows, when we say, I reject Satan and I join the church. That is the kind of the free decision that we have. Not just this one, but every day affirmation of our belonging to the church, of our membership in the church, is important for us being members of the church and for the church to remain the church. Otherwise, if we join the church by our own affirmation, when we are baptized as adults, right? And we get rid after that of our freedom, of our choice, we blindly obey, then we reject our membership in the church, and we reject the nature of the church. We go against the nature of the church. We contribute to making our communities more like sect-like than the church-like. That is, I believe, the basic difference between the Catholic Church. I mean, Catholic in the sense of Soborная, Katholiki Ecclesia, not in the sense of the identity of the Roman Catholic Church necessarily, but in the sense of the Catholic Church. The difference, in my judgment, between the Catholic Soborная Cerkev and the sect is freedom. The moment we reject freedom, human agency, human activity, we reject the church as such, and we actually go against the incarnation per se. We become heretical.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Father Cyril. I think it makes me think, just like your book makes me think of so many things, like my mind is going to explode, that, this immense responsibility that comes with freedom, that sometimes people, according to, say, the famous image of the Grand Inquisitor, of people being eager not to be free because there's so much responsibility from freedom. Also, in a democracy, people get exhausted from all of the messiness of free discussion, and of also letting others exist who are different from you, radically different sometimes, And I think that this Christian rediscovery and also Orthodox Christian rediscovery of the importance of freedom and the immense responsibility, right, that yes, does come with it. If we literally look at the word responsibility as an ability to respond, we get back to this patristic vision, especially in Maximus, that says that, yes, it's God's kinesis or movement to call the person into being, but also in, as a consequence, also to call us eventually to follow him and in his footsteps. And after we are created, right, and he is incarnated, well, if we have the ability to respond to that call, it's risky for us, right? Because he takes us out of our just biological little family tribal units, oftentimes in a way that might lead to a break with them, right? Because we belong on a higher level or a more profound level to him, no longer just to our tribe. So this radical freedom that might be very painful for us to actually realize, right? This responsibility, our ability to respond, this dignifying reality, right, is something I think that is helpful for us very much so, Father, to learn from your book, because you do talk a lot about it. And yeah, you call our attention to things that need to be dusted off, dusted off. As you said, this is a time of judgment for a certain stagnation, I think, of our consciousness as Orthodox Christians. This whole war, right? The horror of support for aggression, for killing, the justification thereof, either through silence or through actual active participation in it. All of that's going on in our church, and your courage and brilliance also. Sorry to seem to want to flatter you. I don't. I'm just, I'm very grateful for you as a voice in our church and for the efforts you make to educate us. And thank you for coming on this show. I hope we could do this again. Father Cyril, if you could find the time, and we'll talk about some other things because there's plenty to discuss. If you find the time, I would be very happy to host you here again.
I always have time for coffee, especially with his sister Vassa.
Okay, that was the right answer to that whole tirade. Thank you very much. Would you like to say something good to our viewers before we go?
Well, I certainly don't insist and don't encourage you to read those books. And that's why we are doing this program, to summarize them and to make it easier for.
But they won't see all of your pictures, your photos.
Well, that is probably, yes, that is probably
photographs.
Something.
And I have encouraged them, Father Cyril, before you joined us, to read the first 26 pages, because that's just it's short and painless. To read the first 26 pages, because that's the summary of the book that you provide. All right. So you were saying you don't have to read the book, but
watch this show. That will be enough. Yes. In case you try to follow up, you're most welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. That's it, everybody. That's it for now. If you're interested in getting one of these mugs, which is a little bit on a different topic, however, it is written in Russian, Orthodox Against the War. We do still have some of these in stock. Get them at coffeewithsistervassa.com. Be well, everybody. And I will chat with you next time on this channel on YouTube. Bye for now.